So today we're really pleased to welcome Jago Cooper, Director of the Sainsbury Centre and Professor of Archaeology at UEA. He's going to be talking about a radical alternative to collections in the museum, which I'm really looking forward to hearing about.
Thanks a lot, Lindsay. Great. I will share my screen. Excellent. Thanks so much. Thanks so much to you, Lindsay, for giving us the invitation to the Collections Trust, for the invitation to come along and talk today. It's really lovely. And I will talk for whatever, half an hour or so. And I'm really happy to answer any questions you got on any topic. So feel free to just store up your questions and ask me anything you like. And the other thing is that, what we're doing here at the Sainsbury Centre, I'm taking you through it, and it's a little bit out there, but I'm a museum person. I'm always worked in museums, so even though it may feel like a bit untraditional, I'm actually quite a boring traditional museum person who's only ever worked in the museum world. And so I'm also quite a collectionsy person. I've spent a lot of time working with Merlin and MI Plus and Axial and doing lots of different collections database projects and digitization and documentation and so I can answer questions on any of that in the sort of perspective of what we're doing. So I'd love to. It'd be really interesting to get your feedback and your thoughts and your ideas and what you think of it all. So what I'll talk about is what we are doing at the Sainsbury Centre. So I'm sure some of you have been to Sainsbury Centre, and if you haven't been, you should come very soon. So this is the Sainsbury Centre. It's this amazing sort of space age museum created in 1978. It was Norman Foster's first ever public building. We have this huge rectangle of that building there, which is like the size of a football pitch. Then we have the same footprint below, underneath that football pitch. And then we have these mezzanine galleries up on the first floor. Then it extends into these underground galleries that come out to that crescent you can see there with a whole series of temporary exhibition spaces. It's an enormous museum, and it's just located on the campus of the University of East Anglia. So it's a real destination art museum. You have to make a big mission to get here. Inside the museum, we have one of the finest collections in the UK. It's absolutely phenomenal collection, really strong in sort of mid-20th century European art, all of your classics, Modigliani, Picasso, Francis Bacon, really strong on sort of global art and material culture, both anthropological and archaeological, objects collected by Cook and things around the world, some of the earliest objects collected all in different parts of the world, including many controversial objects, including Benin bronzes and other parts of the collection which are challenging. And in the 1970s, when it opened, it was a properly radical museum. And its founders, Bob and Lisa Sainsbury, were really cool, and they were visionary. And they initially took the collection to University of Cambridge in the 1960s and were like, we've got this collection, we're thinking about what to do with it when we die. And the University of Cambridge were like, well, this is proper art, that's Greco-Roman sculpture, that goes in the Fitzwilliam. Those are degenerate, we're not taking the Francis Bacons, and that's ethnic tat. We'll take a few pieces for the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, but the rest of it we don't want. And so Bob and Lisa were humiliated, they felt angry, and their very firm belief was that art doesn't have a cultural hierarchy, that there isn't a sort of quality of art or material culture, that all art is equal, no matter where and when it's made, if it has the power to communicate with humans. And that's how they created their collection. So they went away a bit and then went to the second best art museum in the world, which is in Louisiana, which is in northern Denmark. And they met Knut Jensen, who was the founder of that, who founded it in the 50s. And they had lunch, and Knut Jensen said to them some excellent advice, although perhaps all of us will maybe not agree. His advice was, build your own museum, and the secret to doing an amazing museum is don't talk to anyone who works in the museum world. And so they went away and they met Norman Foster, gave him his first ever public building commission. This guy on the left called Ko-Liang Yi, who came up with a visionary way of creating an equal platform for all forms of art and material culture. And on the right, Frank Thistlethwaite, who was the radical Marxist first vice-chancellor of the University of East Anglia, which was started in the 60s. And these people sort of came together to create a bit of an anti-museum. So that's a photograph of when it opened in 1978. It had full-size trees inside the space, this nature culture thing going on. So I could talk a lot about the founding, but the key thing for this talk is that it was properly radical when it opened. So when I've always worked in museums, love all museums, spent my whole life working in them. And my previous job, I was the head of the Americas at the British Museum, which I did for a decade. And so working in museums, I've often thought about the challenges we face, the problems with it, like repatriation, restitution, decolonization, like all these big topics that we all think about. And I used to think about like what their solution could be. And I felt like it's really hard to genuinely take on some of these major challenges because the systemic frameworks within which the museum model is built is entrenched. And unless you can break the founding principles of the museum construct created in the 17th, 18th centuries in Europe, then you can't ever actually tackle the core issues. Like what happens is you do really cool projects in museums, but they end up being sort of like window dressing or project-based stuff around the edges, whilst the core aspect of what the museum does actually doesn't change. And so I used to think about that as a problem and think about potential solutions. And then when the job came up at the Sainsbury Centre, I was like, well, if there's one museum you could have a genuine stab at doing something radical, it's the Sainsbury Centre, because it's the only interview you could go for as director and go to the trustees and be like, this place used to be properly radical. Here is a totally radical idea. I think you should do it because then you're being true to the principles of the museum. And also it gives the trustees license to take on massive risk and radicality because it's in the founding DNA of the institution. So I arrived maybe 4.5 years ago, and I'll just give you a flying update on that, what that sort of concept is, and a tiny bit about the delivery of it over the last few years, and then open it up for questions. So the construct, which I think is really interesting for the Collections Trust, is like, what is the problem that I saw in the museum world, which is the root cause of the problem? The problem for me was that the founding concept of the museum relies on the collection being understood as property, right? The museum model is that you have a collection that is understood as property, and then a sort of beneficial ownership structure is established to preserve, protect, and communicate that collection. And that collection is sort of owned on behalf of like a nation or a local authority, a town council or a university. It's owned on behalf of someone. And the sort of board of trustees is often appointed. You get different governance systems, but board of trustees is appointed, who hire like a CEO, who then is responsible for the preservation, protection, and communication. And that is how the whole thing is structured. For me, that has three fatal flaws in it that you can't get past unless you break the model. The first is that it means that anyone entering one of those spaces feels like you're entering like an authoritative space of objects that you're getting privileged access to, and you are feeling intimidated when you go in. And that sort of rules out half the country. Like loads of people don't go to museums, they don't feel like it's their space, they don't want to walk into those spaces, and they don't go into them. That's a problem. The second problem, which is pretty key, is if ownership is your starting point of your model of why you exist, then how do you ever justify owning other people's stuff, right? It's a terrible place to start your argument as a foundation of why you exist as an entity. So despite however much public good you do by getting people to have access to this stuff, like you're actually like, how do you justify ownership? Like it's a bad place to start. And then the third, and perhaps most important for me, is what actually is like art and material culture? Like what is this stuff? And I particularly work in museums which have like cultural things. That's like traditionally that's where I work. I work a lot around the world on different projects, museums that deal with culture. But like what actually is art? What actually is material culture? If the museum model understands it as property and gives it a sense of sort of commodification and property, what you're doing is denying the emotional power of what art and material culture can actually do in someone's life. And in terms of an experience, that in the museum setting is hugely limiting, and for me is a real problem. So then you go, so I arrived at Sainsbury Centre 4.5 years ago, had this problem in mind, and wanted to have a different type of solution. So arrived, friendly, made a nice place to work, friendly working culture. And then after 5 months, I called all the staff in one Monday morning, and out of the blue, I gave them a 2-hour lecture on something that I'm going to give to you in literally 90 seconds. So any questions, feel free to ask. If you're not going to use property as the model, like what's the alternative? Like how do you have an alternative type of museum? For me, this comes to like pretty big and existential questions about humanity and what we are as humans, right? And it comes to the question of like, despite thousands of years of philosophical and theological debate, there are fundamental questions about the human condition to which we don't have an answer, right? We know as children when we're growing up that inside us is this sort of thing, right? This thing which creates our own identity and our life force. And if we're on the religious end of the spectrum, we might use words like soul or spirit. And if we're more rationalist, we might use words like consciousness or self-reflective thought or an ability to reflect on our own existence. But it really doesn't matter what word we use because we all know we have it, right? It is the core essence of our life and who we are, our identity is the essence contained within this body of flesh and bone. And what is weird is when we meet other human beings, we realize they have one of these things inside them. And what happens with culture and with humanity and with ourselves is that we create relationships with other human beings in an undescribable and difficult way to explain. These connections happen that formulate our own identity, right? Our relationships with other people formulates what we think is right and wrong, our values, how we think about the world. We shapes and forms who we are and how that happens. And if you try to put that process into words, it's exceptionally difficult. For me, great artists, makers, and creators are people who have an ability to channel this raw aspect of human life force, and the creation of art is the materialization of an aspect of that human anima. And at that moment of creation, the hand goes onto a brush that goes onto the canvas, the hands go into clay, you carve the wood. That moment, anima is transferred into this object and it becomes an animate entity, right? It's alive. It's a living entity imbued with an aspect of humanity. It's not a human because it doesn't have a human body, but it is of humanity, like a living aspect of humanity. And this is why every human culture that has ever existed in time and space has created art. It's why we're the only species that does. It's because we have to like get this out, channel this aspect into it. And this becomes a reflective aspect of human emotion and life that we can then engage with and have that same process of understanding about our own existence and our identity through our relationship with the artistic and material worlds. So we want to become, we are now, a museum that understands our collection as living entities. They're actually living entities and they're alive. So what that means is that you have to sort of completely disrupt the sort of the traditional model of the museum. And this is now sort of 2021, I was doing this. It then took me a year of an enormously large number of talks and an enormously large number of stakeholders to get on board with this concept. And I can talk you through that process, but it was a year, it took about a bit more than a year, including everyone like members, patrons, staff, like Arts Council, huge number of people. And then after a year, we had changed the governance of the museum. So the director of the trustees, we rewrote the governance of every staff member and of the governance and what the trustees' job was. And the job was no longer to preserve and protect and communicate the collection. The job of the trustees and staff here is to give these living entities their best lives, right? So once you change the founding principle of the actual museum and change the nature of what an object within the collection is, then it totally transforms everything about the museum changes as a result, like everything, often in unpredictable and unplanned ways. But it has changed absolutely everything about our function, our organization, the structure, how we do programming, like everything has changed as a result of this. And that is really interesting. For people who are interested in this concept intellectually, it's really coming out of the domains of new materialism. And like intellectually and academically, this stuff is not like totally crazy. Like people are writing about this stuff and understanding the nature of how humans interact with the material world around us and actually affects us, affect theory about how it affects us. So there is like an intellectual underpinning to this beyond the sort of ideas. So what does it mean to understand your collection as being alive? So took a year, so about 2022, I then called like all the staff in again, another one of our big meetings, and I was like, right, guys, this is what we do now. We understand our collection as being alive. We are going to announce this to the public in May 2023, and we have 9 months. We have no money, and we need this to be real for people when they come in, right? It's a nice concept, but how do you actually change people's experiences with art to make this more than a concept, but an actual tangible change in the meaningful reality of how people experience art and material culture within a museum environment? So the team here are literally the most amazing museum professionals in the world. Like I love all people who work in museums, but another consequence of changing the founding structure is that you completely liberate the creativity and the energy and the ideas and imaginations of people who work in museums. You take a lot of the shackles off and you can allow people to do things that they just wouldn't be able to do in other museums. and also like foster a sense of that creative energy and ideas, which is interesting. So to give you some sort of like practical examples of like what this looks like in reality, to sort of give it a bit of flesh on the bones. You arrive at our museum now and you're told, we understand the collection is being alive. You're here to meet it much more like you would another human being than you would an inanimate object. And we're here to facilitate you to go on that journey in lots of different ways, however you like or however you don't like. And then we don't ram it down people's throats. Like we're not like, you can, if people want to just come in and see a Picasso, it's totally fine. Like we're fine. But if you want to do it, then we really are there to help you do it. And you get given a map and a little guide on how to do it when you arrive, and you can choose between a digital, an analog, or just a purely experiential way of engaging in different ways. So it's also only pay if and what you want when you come in, and you can go to all the temporary exhibitions we create as a result, but that's another topic. So the first thing is with our, like what we call documentation, our systems. So we work with Smartify, and before we opened, we did a really detailed documentation project on the collection on display, as well as everything else, but really on display. So that meant that if you come into our living area, into our museum, you come into this living area and you can hold your phone up to anything on display using Smartify with the automatic image recognition app. It just automatically recognizes the artwork and it will tell you when it was born and its life story. So this is just a documentation project in which we're getting really detailed information about what's happened with an artwork or an object since it's been created, like it's pretty standard museum stuff. But then what we've done is framed it as a life story so that people feel that when you're meeting something, it catches your eye. There's a way of doing that thing you do with humans, which is like ask them some questions about themselves, find out a bit of information. Like you meet someone in a Coke or like a party, you just like start to exchange a little bit of information about things to decide whether you want to develop that relationship. You can do the same thing with art and material culture. So those life stories are sort of in existence and starts to frame things differently. Then we have now three different digital tours you can do. One is called Living Art, sharing stories and soundscapes. So living art, you're just going to have to come and do these things because that's the best way of doing this. But living art, to give you a tiny bit of a feeling, you're listening to it on your phone or on your headphones, wherever you like how to listen to it, and it says, we understand the collection is being alive. You might well be asking yourself what on earth we're talking about. In the next 20 minutes, we'll introduce you to some works in the collection and get you to go on a sort of like slightly different way of meeting art and material culture to sort of try and go on this journey a little bit. The first one you do on living art is you go up to the Henry Moore's Mother and Child on the top left there. And these are some of the artworks on the living art sort of experiences. And each one is a different way of activating an emotional engagement to try and get people to connect much more in that emotional way you would with someone you build a friendship or you fall in love with in a human relationship. So Henry Moore's Mother and Child, you walk up and you go up to it. It says, stand in front of Henry Moore's Mother and Child. Bob and Lisa, the founders of the museum, were good friends with Henry Moore. And Henry said that his first ever experience of sculpture, what got him into sculpture, was rubbing oil into his mother's body when he was a child. And that's why he was obsessed by this mother and child sculpture, like this study. And that's why he created lots of them. But what we'd like you to do as a visitor is just look into the mother's eyes, look into the mother's eyes of the sculpture, and then close your eyes and try and remember the earliest memory you can of being held, the earliest memory that you can remember of being held in someone's arms. And with your eyes closed, reach out and run your hand down the back of the Henry Moore sculpture. Feel the tactility of the stone and the curvature of the back, and that feeling of security and protection you can have when you're held in someone else's arms. Now open your eyes again and look at it and realize that art isn't like a set of symbols to be translated. It's an emotional state of mind to be in. And if you can find the right emotional state of mind within yourself, then you can connect with the life force of anything on display. And so that tour then continues, and the Maori flute there next to the Henry Moore, you can hear a soundtrack of that being played by a Maori artist. The Tang Dynasty dancers, bottom left, you dance with the Tang Dynasty dancers with a video of the same dance being performed in China. So there's lots of different mechanisms to get people to sort of break museum norms, feel a different way of engaging with art, and feeling like they are in control of the nature of that relationship in their own personal way. And sometimes you feel it and sometimes you don't, and that's totally fine. But what you do see is that when anyone does feel it, like they're gone and they can never change the way they feel about that object again, just like with people. Sharing stories, that's just a demonstration of sort of the Henry Moore in action, which got a bit of thing. And that's the Tang Dynasty dancers and people sort of dancing with the Tang Dynasty dancers, which I'm going to talk you through. And sharing stories. So if objects, art, material culture is alive, like how do you hear from it? So when we have sharing stories, you can choose which voice of the artwork you want to hear from. So on sharing stories, you hold it up and there's different voices of the artwork you can hear from. So in the gallery, we have an artist practitioner perspective, we have an academic knowledge keeper perspective, or we have lived experience perspectives. And as you hold up your phone to the different artworks, you can hear from different voices of the artwork that you choose from. So like we've got a Yinka Shonobare recent acquisition. And in that one, you can artist is like Yinka talking about why he created this mask, like showing how Picasso appropriated West African culture and like he's appropriating the appropriation. You can hear from like art historical perspective, which is Awol Arizku talking about how Yinka's totally flavor of the month as an artist now because he's helping people decolonize museums and therefore he's really popular. Or you can hear from lived experience, which in this case is a Black NHS nurse at Norwich Hospital who's created a spoken word poem looking out of the eyes of the mask and what it feels like to be appropriated within a museum space. So, and then out of the different voices that we have in the sharing stories opportunities, we have like completely diverse set of voices. We have like body shaming experts talking about Picasso. We have like indigenous llama herders talking about llamas from Peru. We have like the High Wycombe Witch of the UK talking about Leonora Carrington. So completely different voices that you can hear from. And the idea is it gives people the feeling that there's no right or wrong way to have a conversation with a work of art. And there's also no right or wrong way to develop the nature of that relationship. You invest in that relationship through practice, art, and like create something, write something, do something in response and develop it. It could be academic, you could buy a book, learn more about it, or it could be lived experience, pursue the ideas contained within this body of work and how it makes you feel emotionally, and then explore that. So you can develop relationships in very different ways. And that's what sharing does, sharing stories does. And again, the same principle applied to all works in display. So we have archaeological, we have anthropological, we have contemporary, but I make no distinction with the concept of living art. For me, archaeological objects are still alive. They're still living in the contemporary. They just have a lot more experience than something which was created last year. But they're all alive and they're all actively dynamic within a space and in dialogue with each other. So this just gives a sort of sense of some of the people talking on the living art, on the sharing stories, and they're completely diverse sets of different people. Some people don't like technology, absolutely fine. So analog, we've created a handbook for living art, which is not specific to the Sainsbury Centre. It's like a practical handbook that you can take to any museum or gallery you go to anywhere in the world. Just pop it in your little bag. And it goes in on the left-hand page, loads of quotes and ideas about the concept of life and our own lives, like philosophy and theology and like indigenous leaders and like interesting people and artists and like museum directors, like saying about like ideas of life within art. And on the right-hand page is a series of very practical things to do within any museum space to get you to activate these same types of relationships in different ways. Like find something that you think looks sad within a museum space. Like, why does it feel sad? Like, get to explore ideas around building relationships in different ways. Again, anyone's interested, I'll pop you a copy in the post and you can judge for yourself. And so you walk around with the handbook, and people, I know that people use this handbook, they take it to museums now in around the country, and now it's being used for teaching as well. At Leicester use it as a teaching tool in their master's course for the museums. Like, it's a really interesting way of activating affect and alternative ways of engaging with material culture. And it's good, and it allows people. This whole thing is really good for people who don't normally go to museums. Like, it really makes you feel like you are in charge of how you go about the experience, and there's no right or wrong way. And that is a really, really crucial aspect, I think, of its success. And then the third was the hardest to come up with, because it was like, how do you get people to experience living art if they don't want to use any technology and they don't want to read any labels, they don't want to read text, they're just going to experience, just like feel the experience of it. So we created a glass exhibition case where you get inside the case and become the work of art and get trapped inside the case, and then all the art and material culture is looking at you. And you're just going to have to come and give it a go. But when you get inside the case, the door closes, the sound insulates, you feel isolated, you feel trapped. You look at these eyes from across time and space looking at you, and you cannot help but flip it and give agency to these artworks. You cannot help think, what do these things think of me? And the weirdest thing is that then the collection becomes unified. It looks like they're all sort of discussing you as you're in the case. And it is an extremely odd experience, and you just can't replicate it, but you can't help project that agency. You're also asked to write a label for yourself before you go in, which makes a mockery of every single museum label you look at for the rest of your life. Like, how do you ever summarize yourself within a few words? So the visitors write these labels and then they put them in a little box. And if you read these labels, they are just absolutely genius. So you come out And you immediately look at objects in glass cases and think you feel sorry for them, that they're trapped and they're isolated. And you also see museum labels and think, wow, like how can you possibly like comprehend the enormity of like life within a small set of words? Um, and then we have a whole series of different like other experiential things you can do. But my favorite thing is that once you flip this idea of agency into art and material culture and actually do it, you feel it, right? The reason that great art is because if you invest in that relationship, it pays back to you, right? That's why art is good. And so with this one, you invest in this relationship, but it's not a human, right? It's not a human being, but it's of humanity. And for me, this has art and material culture has a huge advantages in terms of exploring your own questions about your life over humans. One of which is that you can actually trust art, right? So with this one, you are asked to lie down or be underneath this Giacometti portrait of his brother Diego, and you're asked to tell the painting a secret that you would never tell another human being, right? Tell it a secret in your mind that you would never tell another human being, because you can share your innermost secrets with a work of art, and you're not having to show off to anyone or impress them or be something you're not. You can be totally raw and honest, and you can trust the painting to hold that secret, and you can trust it to develop and explore that thought and be there when you're ready to talk, think about that, and come back and visit it again and think about those ideas and explore them. And what art and material culture are materializations of some of the most incredible individuals, political movements, cultural ideas, cultural perspectives that you could ever meet in your life. And therefore, you can explore those thoughts and innermost thoughts from completely different cultural ideas and imaginations and perspectives. And if you invest in those relationships, it can empower you to change how you feel and actually change your thoughts about your own values, your own identities, your own concerns around the world. So therefore, there is an absolutely natural segue that happened in an unplanned way, that we no longer do exhibitions here on like questions that would come from the worlds of sort of art history or anthropology or archaeology. Like these living entities are just like life, and therefore what we want to do is answer questions that any human being has while they sit underneath that chair. But so we reach out on social media and we ask people what are the most important questions that people have in their lives, and then we find ways to address those questions. So each 6 months, we take a different question and then we activate art to explore that question. I'm going to skip over sound escapes because I haven't got enough time and I don't want to like to delay my little questioning time. But I'll tell you about sound escapes another time. So with the questions, we take 6 months, we explore one question, and then we reach out, we organize think-ins for people to come in, like artists and curators and academics, to come in with a big question. And then we're like, right, how are we going to activate the nature of our relationship with art and material cultural living entities to help people explore their own answers to the most fundamental questions they have in their lives? Like, how are we going to come up with a plan for the future in the state of climate change? What is truth? We did 6 months on what is truth. We've done 6 months on why we take drugs. Our current exhibition season is about why can the sea survive us? And in October, we're asking how do we stop people killing each other? So what we do is we create a museum landscape. We're activating this idea of life within art, and then we create multiple exhibition shows across the whole landscape in which people then explore that question. So maybe take the drugs one as an example. Why do we take drugs? You might think how that's going to work. So in the why do we take drugs season, we had 5 different shows, completely different, created for that 6-month season. We had one looking at drugs, a big show in collaboration with the Shipibo Canibo community from Peru and the Amazon, who flew over and worked on the show and developed a massive show on ayahuasca, and then looking at a deep dive into ayahuasca and understanding when is a drug, when's it a medicine, when's it a rooted cultural core of an identity, and how does that flow through into our understanding of the relationship between drugs and medicine. We did a big show with Lindsay Mendick, looking at alcohol and prescription drugs, which was very biographical, her creating a body of new works, exploring her feelings of anxiety and anxiousness that you feel when you're sort of hungover, and creating a whole series of works in our living area. We worked with Graham McIndoe and Linda Skaleli, who worked on heroin addiction, called Heroin Falls, looking at cross-cultural exploration of heroin addiction, comparing a township in Johannesburg with inner city New York, and looking at the shared experiences of heroin addiction completely cross-culturally from 2 people who didn't know each other before we developed the show, who then collaborated with each other to create a show exploring heroin addiction cross-culturally. We worked with Ivan Morrison, and a really cool artist who worked with a series of Norfolk farmers, crazy projects, which turned out amazingly, in which he persuaded a load of Norfolk farmers to understand that they were actually drug dealers and they were pushing chemicals onto their land, and that actually people were ingesting loads of drugs in their lives without realizing it because all the chemicals were coming into their bodies. And they're looking at that sort of idea of ecology and drugs. And he got these Norfolk farmers to come be life models, and be drawn, and to strip away the vestiges of their farming past to find their true natural selves, and then create a series of life drawings that he then turned into these outdoor sculptures of these sort of anthropomorphic forms from the bodies created outside using the crops from the farms. So it gives you a flavor of how, when you take a question, which is of interest to anyone, you're trying to activate the nature of the relationship with art using this living art concept to allow people to explore the museum and find their own answers. It's really important to say that we as the museum are not the people coming up with the solution to the question. I'm not the person who tells you the answer to the question. What we do is create a landscape, a dynamic landscape, where you can meet anyone or meet these living entities in completely different ways, and then you find all these totally different perspectives, and then you find the right answer which suits you, like what gives you inspiration, imagination, a way of thinking about this question, like ideas for how you might pursue thinking about it more and learning more about it, and hopefully trying to find your own answers, and then create social action, social change through the ability to take on the biggest questions of our time, like climate change and conflict and drugs, etc. So I feel like I've spoken quite a lot. How am I doing for time? Yeah, I'm overrunning. So I will stop talking now, but maybe I will just finish with saying, like, obviously, once you change principles by which you understand them, like, it changes everything about the museum, and it changes like the decisions we can make. So I can persuade my board to do incredible things. So if you look on our channel, you'll see a couple of things that just give an idea about this. So Dear Art is a film which is a travel campaign, advertised at Living Artworks currently in other museums around the world, that they should come on holiday to the Sainsbury Centre because then they get treated like they're alive. So you should watch the Dear Art. Day release, we just released a couple of day release films, which are looking at what would living art want to do if it could go. It's been trapped in a museum for 60 years. Where would it want to go for a day if it could? So we took Henry Moore's Mother and Child up to a housing estate in Castleford, to where Henry Moore was born, and we took a Francis Bacon to the pub in Soho. And so I can go to my board and say, Francis Bacon, of course it wants to go to the pub where Francis and Peter, the guy in the painting, met, and we can take it there, and that's what it wants to do. And therefore, it just gives you the indication that once you change the foundations, you can change everything about how you go about working with the collection in very different ways. So thanks for listening, and I'm really happy to answer any questions you like. And I will leave this up for a second just to show that, like, we're not completely mad, and that this is like some people who have said nice things about us, just to show that, I don't know, it's gone quite well since it launched. Thanks very much.